Thanks everyone for joining this morning. Again, this is Charles King. I'm the Chief Technology Officer with Evergy, and I'm going to attempt to chair this subcommittee as we go forward here. And again, just by matter of brief review, I know you all probably got an email from Allie on this. We talked about it some in the kickoff meeting, but the goal of this subcommittee is really to identify the key resources and the components that are needed for a coordinated and collaborative cybersecurity response annex to the Kansas response plan. So today's kind of a kickoff of sorts for this subcommittee. And so we're going to do that today with kind of a broad overview and discussion around cyber instance and disruption response. Hopefully it's going to help frame up our ideas for the subcommittee, and we'll discuss some general high-level ideas around short and long-term recommendations as we go forward. And then try to finish up today just by kind of gathering everybody's input, thoughts, and round out the conversation by identifying on a go-forward basis sort of our resources and our speakers to help frame our deliverables that we're going to have coming up. So as we get started this morning, can we go around and have everybody introduce themselves? At least for this meeting, we may have to do it more than once to get everybody's names and faces connected. I know Zoom helps us do that, but can we go around this morning and introduce everyone? And maybe Jonathan will have a chance to join here, and we'll kick off in a little bit with some discussion from Doug.
I'll go first. My name is Kevin Comstock. I'm the Director of IT at the Kansas Secretary of State's office.
Thanks, Kevin.
Colonel Hewlett.
Colonel.
Yes, good morning, everybody. This is David Hewlett. I am the Director of Information Technology for the Kansas Army and Air National Guard. Over.
Thank you.
I'm Allie Denning. I'm not a member of the subcommittee, but I'm acting as a program manager for the Cybersecurity Task Force. So here to take notes and record and hopefully stream live to YouTube when I can get it to work.
I'm Samir Arif. I'm the Director of Public Affairs for OITS, and I'm helping Allie here. I think, Mike, are you there?
Yeah, I am. I'll be dropping in and out. I've got other meetings, but I'm Mike Maida. I'm the CIO for the City of Wichita. Just as a co-chair, wanted to pop into as many of these as I can. So here to mostly listen, but maybe jump in. But I will apologize. I have a 9:30 that I have to hop off, and then I'll try and come back.
All right. Hey, thanks, Mike. All right, did we get everyone? All right, Allie, you think Jonathan may be joining later still?
I do. I haven't heard back from him yet. So hopefully we'll see him.
Okay. All right, and we've got Doug still with us?
I'm here, sir.
Okay. All right, so Doug, I know you're busy and booked this morning, so we're very pleased to have you join us. Doug is the Executive Director at the National Association of State Chief Information Officers, CIOs. And I think, Doug, you're going to kind of kick us off here this morning with an overview for our conversation, get some thoughts flowing, and hopefully we'll be able to pick up from there and carry forward. So appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Charles, and appreciate the opportunity to be here today before the task force. This is a fairly regular activity for us. I've spoken in front of many cybersecurity commissions, task force, and committees over the years since they initially have been formed, and certainly applaud the state for taking this kind of broad stakeholder engagement. It is something that we have recommended for a number of years. So again, my role as executive director is to lead both the association, but also our portfolio of work, which includes a significant amount of research, white papers, recommendations, guides, as you would expect, frameworks, playbooks. We do all of that and have for many years. In addition, we have a government affairs and advocacy component. So we're heavily involved with our friends at the federal government around cybersecurity, both from a policy side and from a legislative side, and most importantly for the states and local governments during this season, a funding side. So we're actively involved and certainly be willing to answer questions about those. So I'm going to quickly go through, I've got a few slides just to kind of talk about, I think, one particular element of this discussion, which is cyber disruption. So it looks to me, in looking at the set of questions that you have and objectives and outcomes, you've really nailed a number of things around cyber incident response. And I think that's cyber incident response is well documented in a variety of approaches and tools, particularly the NIMS framework, using the emergency operations capabilities, using the existing frameworks of emergency management. So cyber incident response has followed for many years, kind of that model, the ones that have been integrated with other things like the emergency management role and the Homeland Security role and the National Guard and other players. I know you have these folks on these various subcommittees. I'm going to spend more of my time this morning really quickly talking about what has changed in the last few years and discuss more about cyber disruption, which has been more of an issue for the states in the last 5 or 6 years and dealing with this new, more aggressive and advanced threat. And we've seen that play out. And I'll point to some of the research we have done and kind of go through that. So let me share my screen real quick. And what I will do is provide these slides to Allie, and we can get this moving pretty quickly. So can you now see this application up?
Yes, got it. Got
You
it.
see that? All right, very good. So very quickly, this is not going to be a surprise to you all, but in terms of the state government risk profile, this has been, again, fairly steady but growing in terms of the attack surface and things that are going on. And clearly over the last few years, we've seen more aggressive, and both the volume and the velocity of threats, particularly around the intensity of that coming from nation states, organized crime, with a highlight on ransomware, because ransomware has now become the new variant that is a very effective business model and actually combines elements of both an incident, but also disruption in the continuity of government. So I think the key thing here is understanding that cyber disruption has become a much more prevalent approach, particularly in the public sector. Certainly we've seen it in other sectors of the economy and the critical infrastructure, but in this case, if you look at the numbers, the targets have been local governments and K through 12 organizations, with some, many attacks on states, but not as successful. So I think we need to talk about what's happening in that space. The critical infrastructure impact for states, which rely, and by states, I mean not state government, the whole of state, we'll talk about that, really gets into the discussion around the disruption of the continuity of government and the continuity of infrastructure. And that's what we've seen play out here in the last few years. And it's something that is first addressed in actually the National Response Framework back in 2011. So over 10 years ago, and the preparedness work that the federal government was doing, they started talking about cyber impacts on critical infrastructure, and the game has certainly been elevated dramatically. So there's other elements that you all talk about here, but you certainly know this. I think the other thing to point out is that cybersecurity is, as I've said for many legislative testimonies, both at the national and state level and to many task forces, that we have got to change the conversation around cybersecurity being an IT risk and an IT primary responsibility. Cybersecurity is a business risk to the continuity of government. It is obviously for the private sector as well, but it requires a much more complex orchestration around governance and particularly communicating the risk. I found this particularly a challenge with elected public officials, both legislators, appropriators, governors, others that I speak to, is that I think the default kind of reaction to some kind of IT incident is that's the CIO or the CTO or the CISO. They're going to handle that because it's IT. No, it's actually a business risk to your organization. So I think bringing that message to people is important as you do your work, that This is really about the continuity of government and more about associating those risks. Those risks are the same as any other natural or man-made disaster. And what we've seen certainly in the cyber disruption space is that's what's going on. So I'm going to refer, as I mentioned, we do a lot of research. I'm going to refer to now several quick examples of research studies and national reports where we've highlighted where we are in cyber disruption. Again, we've done more work in the past around cyber incident response. This gets into a, kind of a new element of this. So each year we do a national state CIO survey. We're actually finishing up the final draft of the 2021 survey now. We released in early October. This report from 2020 was released in October of 2020, and it has perspective of 49 state CIO respondents. Again, this is the chief information officer. Every state has one. They're all appointed officials, high ranking, and they're the executive leadership responsible for the business side of information technology in concert with working with all of their state agencies and other groups. You can see the question about the current status of their program. This is not a true capability maturity model, but it's kind of assessing the maturity over a period of time. This is a longitudinal question that we've been asking since 2010. So we have 10 years of data tracking where states are. As you can see, we didn't add cyber disruption response plan until 2016. But element here, we have about 2/3 of the state indicated that they have some type of cyber disruption response plan. That is, again, to clarify, that is not a cyber incident response plan. That's actually dealing with cyber disruption and the broader kind of constituency, bringing in the whole of state conversation and not just executive branch of state government. And that's been a message that we've been bringing because our state CIOs are responsible for most authority only extends to the executive branch of state government. So again, we're seeing about 2/3 of the states have that. Some, including things like the state of Michigan, were very early adopters they came out with their first cyber disruption response plan, which was a joint effort along with the National Guard and state police and emergency management. Came out with that in first phase of that was 2014. So they were an early adopter of this model of bringing in utilities, local governments, and others to talk about that. And again, what the major threat issue there for many states early on was the fact that they were beginning to see simultaneous events, particularly major denial of service or DDoS attacks, simultaneous with things like civil unrest, with public events, with riots. In the case of Michigan, it actually played out with the Flint water crisis. So as activists were unhappy with the governor and environmental folks around the Flint water crisis, they began a simultaneous event to attack the infrastructure of the state government and the local governments around their critical IT systems, including they're trying to attack their SCADA systems in terms of their water supply. So these first indicators, and that's one of our early recommendations around the more proactive assessments is be prepared for these types of events of cyber disruption. So that is trying to change the game, particularly in areas, if you've heard the word hacktivism, we've seen that on the rise, but certainly more recently, a rise in dramatic criminal activity, particularly nation states that are designed to disrupt the continuity of government and our democracy in some way that is very different than trying to steal the data and resell it on the dark web. So different things going on there in terms of cyber disruption as again, a term that was introduced about a decade ago. So part of that is just, I know you've had conversations, I see it in some of your comments around whole of state. And so whole of state really is again, a phrase that's come about in terms of cybersecurity to look beyond what's going on in traditionally the branches of government and look at cybersecurity as a broad stakeholder engagement, collaboration with state agencies, local governments, utilities, private companies. Your task force represents a broad spectrum of these players, and it's important, particularly the ones that are what I would call providers to the state institutions in the utility space and healthcare and others, that they are involved in these conversations. And so you see a growth in year over year. We see a little bit of a in progress dip because we're kind of planning more and a couple of percentage points up, about a quarter of the states that are taking a whole of state approach. This is again this is going to be a long growth pattern, I think, over time as states across the country understand this whole of state concept and begin, as they're doing their cyber disruption plans, but most importantly, their cybersecurity strategic plans. Again, about 2/3 of the states have dedicated cybersecurity strategic plans. That those plans are now crafted with a whole of state approach. So let me go into now some recommendations. Any questions or comments? I want to pause there and make sure that I don't do all the talking here. If you all have any questions, this is pretty, this is kind of setting the groundwork for this conversation. Okay, let me talk.
I'm just kind of curious, like
Yeah.
talking about all of those different players, how do you go about
Right.
getting all of them involved in one conversation? I mean, we're starting that a little bit with the task force, but
Right.
I mean, I'm someone who's been in state government a long time. I have a good feel for state government, even local government, because we have to work with them some. But as far as utilities, universities, healthcare, and all that, I mean, it seems like it's a lot of people. So I'm just not sure how you get all of those people involved in that conversation.
It is, Kevin. You're right. And I spent many years in state government as well. Before I had a real job before NASCIO, so I understand that. And we spent a lot of time talking about cybersecurity as well. The challenge there is getting them to understand that this is a business risk to the state, and by that I mean, not state government. So I broaden that conversation, and I think again, examples of many other states that have been able to bring these folks to the table. And I think, I'll use the phrase kind of a kitchen cabinet approach, as opposed to a formal task force or committee. Starting out because some informality without attribution is very important, because they may be hesitant to share their experiences. And so I think you have to do that in a way that kind of engages them without, the state government has a regulatory umbrella as well. So I think you have to kind of put that aside and say, we need to do this in the interest of the state from a collaborative approach, particularly around the utilities and the universities and the healthcare, because, and there's a number of examples in the last couple of years about major healthcare institutions, including a couple of university healthcare, being the victims of ransomware that particularly simply shut down their capability to care for patients and to perform operations and to get to any medical records. Well, that doesn't have just an impact on that institution. It has an impact on the citizens of the state, has an impact on the lives of citizens and their communities and everything else. So I think you have to basically raise the conversation that, in an incident or a disruptive activity that is driven by a cybersecurity event doesn't simply impact your institution. It has, has waves, has collateral damage that can have issues. That's particularly the case with utilities and others. So I think that's the message that most states have been bringing, is convening these folks for just collaborative conversations to begin with before you get into the formality of perhaps engaging them. Because in the information sharing world, as you know, many of the private firms are going to be, if not, they're going to totally resist the information sharing from an incident perspective, but you have to engage them in some way. So that's been the approach that has served to be successful in other states. And the other, I think, is what I'll call strategic intent. And that is, as you craft a cybersecurity strategic plan, say that this plan is based on the foundational concept that the state is not simply the state government entity, but in fact requires that collaborative model across the board. And local governments in today's environment, local governments are, and particularly K through 12, but I'll say local governments are the perfect example of, they need a significant amount of assistance from state government. Whether they choose to accept that or not is up to them. But I think across the country, and there are again many examples of what states are doing to provide assistance in a meaningful way to their local jurisdictions. And again, I think it has to be a kind of an offer of assistance model to begin with, to engage them in this conversation, because they're all part of this ecosystem. And I think that's something that perhaps many of them don't understand, is that they're not part of the broader ecosystem. So yeah, it's definitely requires lots of communication, Kevin. That's what I found. And engage.
So Kevin, just from a practical perspective, I've already started talking to folks at the university. We have connections with like Evergy and some of our some of our partners on the utility side. We're a utility ourselves on the water side. So I agree in terms of some cities need, especially smaller cities, are going to need that assistance. Usually at our level, unless, if it's something that involves the federal government, like something that they're already tracking, we already engage with the state on a regular basis. So, I think to kind of, my answer to your question would be, we're kind of disseminating that out, right? Not as specific to the task force, but as part of the task force to make those connections and have those conversations.
Okay, very good question, though. And again, it's in some cases it may take a while to, it's a lot of this has to do with the trust equation, as you all know. So that's a big part of this conversation. Just a couple of quick things on, obviously you always have to kind of focus on the business side of, answering the why question. And certainly there's lots of responses to, why cyber disruption and why include that as a broader construct beyond simply incident response, because in most states that's well documented. Usually on the executive branch that we represent, it's going to be the Chief Information Security Officer, the CISO of the state. Every state has a CISO. Almost all of them report to the state CIO or CTO. And I think, that's going to be the approach that most states, and it's well documented. A number of these are appended their annexes to the emergency operations plan. That's something in a cyber disruption model that's very important to engage emergency management in this conversation, because you may have to invoke emergency orders, which many states have done, under a significant ransomware, regional or widespread ransomware incident, or some other kind of widespread cyber disruption impact around, let's say, a critical infrastructure like the electric utility that requires some response, just like a natural disaster might or a man-made disaster, a chemical explosion or whatever. That generally requires, we've seen massive floods in the Southeast and in my part of the country already, and governors have all issued emergency orders by invoking their clauses under their emergency annex to deliver aid. And so states have now adopted that same model for cyber disruption, saying we're going to treat this the same way as we would any other. We may need to provide assistance. We may need to provide funding. We may be able to, for example, send in the National Guard to assist in a reactive mode. Many states have done that. So lots of things you can do under that. So, clearly this could be many discussions about why you want to do it. But I think the main thing is getting this broader understanding that we're beyond, it's certainly beyond the theft of data. We're now into, again, this disruptive mode where the continuity of government or other institutions that support government are at risk. So that's important. And I think that the key thing is obviously is what you might do in terms of the the plan itself is basically all up to the culture of the state. And it looks like, there we go. Look like a little frozen there on the slide deck. So what's necessary? Key key things, not surprisingly, is a discussion around three things. One is governance. What is the shared decision-making model? And that has to be well instituted in advance of anything, just like you would any other. And many of these are, the details of this are outlined in the emergency management framework or the incident management framework that the state has adopted. Many of those most states have adopted NIMS, and they come from FEMA. You can use the same model in cyber disruption with perhaps a different set of players with a broader audience. But again, many of these questions you've outlined in your objectives, basically making sure that the integration component, because that's as important as well. So you've got governance, you've got integration, you've got communication and training. Those are all high priorities in terms of what's necessary to be successful. There's clearly many others, but I think that I would highlight those as being critical in our experience to the success of the states. Having that communication and that integration, those conversations, having those relationships early. So when an incident happens, and we've seen this in states when it happens, it's very clear who's going to be in charge, who's going to be the incident command, what resources are available, and what laws or policies can be invoked. And I think a good example has gotten a lot of attention is 2019, the significant ransomware attack in the state of Texas, where 23 municipalities were essentially shut down because of a ransomware attack. The state, because of what they had done in advanced planning, coordination, able to invoke an emergency order from the governor, they were able to marshal the resources the next morning and begin to, on the remediation side, and bring resources to those 23 municipalities, many of them fairly small, most of them fairly small. That's a good example of having all that was kind of pre-built before the incident. That is not the case in many states where they haven't had those conversations on what's going to happen when we have this incident. So scenario planning and obviously exercises, the kind of the art of the possible is really important to discuss, because again, a few years ago, people were not, institutions weren't talking about that level of disruption. So the one thing I'll end with here is simply a discussion on what resources. There are a lot of resources available on the whole cyber disruption topic now, including obviously the federal frameworks and their response frameworks that have been updated, but also a number of other states, starting with Michigan, looking at New York, Connecticut, others that have taken a whole of state approach and have a documented cyber disruption response plan. I think Illinois has put together a pretty nice document on cybersecurity in general for their response. What we have developed, and again, this is now 5 years old, our cyber disruption response planning guide, which is about 100-page guide with a checklist and a set of other details around the driving and what's driving the environment. Certainly some of it is dated. We haven't updated it in 5 years, but it was based on this principle of that cyber disruption, as we started this in 2015, was going to be the next wave of what public institutions like state governments were going to see, whether it was from criminal activity. We couldn't have envisioned, I don't think then, we talked about ransomware, but certainly not at the level that we're seeing it. We talked about, nation state, we talked about hacktivism, because we were seeing at that point a beginning uptick of things like hacktivism, particularly around civil unrest and other public events. You go through the last 5 or 6 years of major civil unrest, the riots in Baltimore, in Ferguson, Missouri, all of these had simultaneous cyber incidents that were taking place. Particularly with anonymous and other hacktivist groups, were trying to disrupt government, doing things like doxing and trying to find public official data and exposing that. So anything they could to disrupt the actual continuity of government, they were doing. So that's something to think about. So this is available to all states. It's on an ASIA website. We recommend, we have sections, and I've simply outlined those that are important to kind of look at all these elements in cyber disruption. I think obviously communication to us is the most important, broad communication about what needs to be done. How is this different than an incident response? And obviously the two are co-joined in a sense, because you got the same discipline and business capabilities you're going to bring to cyber incident response that you will with cyber disruption. But again, I think broader stakeholder engagement is really important on this, bringing in all those elements like the state police, emergency management, Homeland Security, National Guard. And in some cases, the decision might be that in this case, either it's a emergency management function or it's a function of the Homeland Security advisor, depending on the source of that. But again, I think that's important to make all those decision points, all those determinations in advance of an event, so you don't have collisions and you don't have miscommunication, you don't have agencies sending out press releases that counteract something that's coming from from an emergency management lead, from the on-scene incident commander. All those things have to be addressed early on. So a lot of those are again outlined in this guide, and so a number of states have done that. So I think our recommendations that I can leave you with across the board are a simple subset of many of those that you would find in this guide, as well as what we've heard from states. And I think a big part of that is that collaboration and necessary governance around cyber disruption, having those conversations early, having those conversations with your private sector entities like all of your utilities. Obviously, your local governments need to understand that. And if you look at the patterns in terms of the last several years, the primary targets around this space are going to be local governments in K through 12. And those are the ones we just had one last week where a city in New Hampshire, unfortunately, paid a ransom for the second time after being the victim of a BEC, a business email compromise attack. And again, they didn't listen to the recommendations of their advisors round one after paying $1 million in the first ransomware incident. And now they've come back, they were looking at, I think, as bad guys by a soft target, and they just paid another $1.5 million, $1.2 million again. And so we're going to continue to see this play out because this has become a very successful business model that has changed from disrupting. So the continuity of that government was disrupted for days as they were unable to conduct business. But now you have the additional threat of the release of the data. So you're combining these two threat patterns, and it's become very problematic for states. And you certainly, you've seen, I don't need to go through all the front page news about the other ransomware attacks on utilities and on transportation and on food safety, all these things, food distribution, all these things are targets as part of the critical infrastructure. And I think that's important to recognize that really nothing is really without being capability of being disrupted. If you look at how innovative and the fact that these criminal actors are working 24/7 to build, they've got basically ransomware as a service capabilities today, and they're always looking for soft targets. So when you start talking about cyber disruption, it may be, the state has maybe the capabilities and resources to assist their local governments, and that's, I think, part of what I'll talk about with the other task force was that coordination and collaboration thing. So that's kind of important. So again, a long set of recommendations. These are just a few of those that you can talk about. There is some, I would be remiss for not commenting in terms of things like the integration with emergency management, emergency operations, the relationship between Homeland Security and emergency management and the office of the CIO. All these things can create tension within state government about, either what I call either the "you're not the boss of me" conversation or "I'm in charge" conversation. So again, our strong recommendation is to work all that out with a collaborative approach. And you've seen states that have developed cyber disruption response plans. It's a 3 or 4 agency function with input from the external stakeholders outside of state government. So because again, there will be collateral damage around some of these things, only if it's because their services are disrupted and that whatever government agency that is unable to perform their critical functions during a time period. So I'll end with this in terms of our research and our over 10-year national study of cybersecurity. We do every biennial, we do a national study with Deloitte Consulting. We published that in 2020. We'll be working on another survey here, probably early 2022. We'll begin that conversation again. These are the chief information security officers complete this very exhaustive survey. We had, I think, 51 states completed, so remarkable response rate. This is kind of looked at as the preeminent discussion around what's going on. And I think that from that and from our other research, you can distill when you look at state governments, what are the patterns of success? I'm not going to call these best practices because in some cases they're really good, but they're really identified, like what are states doing? And I've highlighted the top 6 elements of what states do that are successful in terms of cybersecurity. And a big part of that has to do with what you're doing, which is enterprise leadership and governance, having a task force, recognizing that this is, not about our IT networks and systems as much as it is about the continuity of government, and it's a significant business risk. But here's some of the other things I think you can look at, and particularly the adoption of cybersecurity frameworks and controls are really important. The NIST cybersecurity framework is used by the majority of the states today, and it's growing. And I think it's just a maturity issue. Everything I talked about this morning is freely available to you in any of our reports. I just highlighted a few of those that we've released over the last year or so, including our Stronger Together report, which is a joint report with the National Governors Association. I'm going to speak to that in our next session when I speak to the Coordination and Collaboration Task Force about but some of our recommendations there in terms of working with local jurisdictions and what states can do. There's a long laundry list of those things that we believe local governments state governments can start to help their local jurisdictions as part of this, kind of team sport discussion. Questions for me?
I got a question. I know our task force has the word response in it, but a big part of cyber incident and disruption for me is prevention. I don't know what other states are doing to try to train people out there and reach out so that you can stop things from happening before that.
Yes.
So I don't know if you can talk to that at all about the prevention side of it as opposed to just the response.
Yes, I agree, Kevin. In fact, I would, I guess our stance on that is obviously, if I could go back up to the maturity one, you will see that is number one. So that's the first thing we put on this is develop security awareness training for workers and contractors. So again, if you look at the evolving business models in state IT, it's moving more towards managed services, what we describe as CIO as a broker, more outsourcing, more managed services, more multi-supplier integration, MSI models. We have several states that are almost wholly outsourced in managed services. So they're moving in that direction. So we've got to include contractors. So we think that's a critical component is training across the board. Because you're right, part of that is the prevention and part of it is recognizing that it is, I think you all know about the insider issues, but the human factor is a critical component. The majority of successful ransomware incidents are because of phishing, a phishing attack, malware that results in that impact on that jurisdiction, local government, utility company, whatever it is. It's a human factor, which obviously has to be addressed with training and has to be addressed with cyber hygiene at the highest level. And I think this is, a cultural issue that has to be addressed is that everybody's job is cybersecurity. You've heard that. It's not just the IT officials and the CISO and the CIO and the CTO. It's got to be every individual, every employee has to understand that. And the human firewall discussion has been going on for years, but we still see, if you look at the numbers, that's the preventive aspect of that. And a big part of that is training. Another big part of that is simply instituting the controls, right? Minimizing, the things like you all know that need to be done. We work with CIS and the MSISAC. We just published a joint report with CIS around those controls. And I think that's really important to understand that that's a huge element of that is training and awareness. And it can't simply be, we talk about drip irrigation, where many states have instituted monthly training requirements, even if it's just a few minutes, because saying you're doing cybersecurity training by having, 1 day a year is inadequate. And also, I think the discussion, which is very important, and we see this in the private sector more than state government and universities, is whether that training is mandatory. And if you look at these numbers, the 96%, less than 60% of those that answered their cybersecurity training is mandatory for all employees. So, as states begin to adopt move towards a zero trust framework model, that's going to be a critical component when you trust no one, trust no thing, trust no network. Obviously, an individual is your that individual is your greatest threat. So, certainly prevention is important, but I think also the resiliency, understanding, building resiliency into your model is critical as well. So you can, I think, you can expect and plan and anticipate that there will be an incident. It's most likely going to be a cyber disruption in the future, because that's the pattern. It's just more for the bad guys. We all know that it's a better business model. It's more cost effective for them to conduct a ransomware attack than try to steal your data and resell it. So we see that growth in the future. So think about your training components. And again, we have seen states, and we are certainly, supporting an effort to provide for perhaps statewide price contracts or statewide leverage the buying power of the state with perhaps, let's say, a cybersecurity training platform that can be accessed by local governments and other jurisdictions as at a unit cost, which is much lower than they can do themselves. We are going to put together a set of recommendations and guidance for CISA, for the Federal Cybersecurity Agency, along with the upcoming infrastructure bill, which has $1 billion in it for state and local government cybersecurity development. And we're going to strongly urge that states look at leveraging their buying power to help their brethren in local governments. So again, I would point out the prevention is clearly important, but there's, got to match that with other capabilities and resources that that states have to help out their other jurisdictions.
Hey, Doug, it's Charles. First off, thank you very much for taking all the time this morning. Very helpful overview. Appreciate that very much. Quick question for you on the maturity survey data that you've got here, and maybe the answer is it's in this broader report. You had one trending view earlier, but is there a trending view kind of at a question level available as well? Over through, I think you mentioned 10-year period or something for the survey. Is there trending across those years on these questions?
In some cases, yes, Charles, there is, and there's two reports. One is the view of our state CIO report, and so we do provide some year over year, as we did with the whole of state. That was new, so you can go. We do provide some year over year comparisons on that. On this particular question, again, we've been asking the CIO this question. We do have some comparative data. Some of that isn't published, but I think my disclaimer here would be that this is the view of the CIO at the time, state CIO that at the time that responded to this question. So we always have to remind people that our current median tenure is 23 months for state CIO.
Okay.
So that is a challenge when you're looking at the longitudinal data, is that as CIOs turn over with gubernatorial transitions, you all can appreciate that you may have a different perspective. That CIO in that seat may have a different view, for example, of some of this. I think a good example of this is we're actually seeing obtaining cybersecurity insurance was something we added a few years ago. That was not available, obviously, to public sector. Not a cyber liability insurance wasn't available. Once it became available, the market was pretty immature. We added that. So we went from about a 10% adoption rate to, as you see, 55%. I think what we're going to see is that's going to either flatline or decline over the next several years. So the product is still, in comparison, is not as mature as it could be, but also because of these incidents, there's a debate in the marketplace, particularly in the state CIO world, of whether or not cyber liability insurance is, the efficacy of that is really as strong as people believe. Challenge with underwriters, challenge with now premiums that have gone up 200% and 300% and 400% in a year. So as many states are now deciding they may want to look at going to self-insured, or they simply are going to abandon their liability insurance because it's a false sense of protection. So, particularly in the ransomware. So what we've seen is, jurisdictions that you've probably read about that have paid significant ransoms, that money is coming from their insurance carrier. And so those deductibles are going up across the board in the marketplace, as well as the premiums for state and local governments. So these are things we have to monitor. We just don't have we can't put all of that, what I just said, in one line in a table that you see. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, a lot behind, a lot behind some of these things that are going on. But so much of this, as you all know, so much of this is around culture. It's around organizational and stakeholder engagement. It's very little of what we see has to do with technology, quite frankly, in the cyberspace. More than enough technology to go around in terms of what states can do to invest in technologies and tools. What they don't have is enough resources in terms of their skilled staff to go around.
Yep. All right. Well, I know that I don't know if Allie had to drop yet or not, but I know we need to certainly try to give you a break before your next speaking commitment this morning.
That's fine, sir. That's fine. I'm glad to do it. Obviously, we have resources, and my colleague, my director of policy and research, Meredith Ward, she's the co-author of our Deloitte cybersecurity study, which again has a lot of good data. So I would urge you all to take a look at that, because there's a lot more data in there about a wide variety of topics and priorities, and what I kind of like, even the question we've asked a few months ago about, what do we see on the horizon from the state of being priority investment areas? And I think, that is really around identity and access management being critical, adoption of a zero trust framework, broader risk assessments, more comprehensive risk assessments for state government agencies. So we've have a list of those items that all the states have said these are going to be our priorities in the next 2 to 3 years, and in what we termed then a post pandemic. So that was in June and July. We called it a post pandemic world in state government. That's not entirely accurate today, but then kind of what are states going to do? And those are some of the critical things we see. And part of that's going to be more collaboration with their stakeholders. And so I think that's important as well.
Absolutely.
Okay.
You made me think of one comment. I was going to ask you a question, but I don't want to keep you. One of the aspects I think that's becoming more and more front and center these days is the area of supply chain risk.
Absolutely.
And I'll extend that to third parties. You mentioned the whole of state approach, which is certainly critical and important. That whole of state approach, especially as you reach out to utilities and healthcare, universities, we've got our own third parties and suppliers as well that represent vulnerability into our ecosystems, right?
Yes. And Charles, I have a whole other conversation about that. And one of the things that's exceedingly challenging for state and local governments and the public sector in general is software supply chain compromises and what they can do, and even supplier compromises from the hardware aside. Very, very difficult for states to be proactive in that space. They just don't have the resources. They don't have the capabilities to do that. So I think we were involved in a number of closed briefing sessions with CISA as well as others around the SolarWinds compromise. We received briefings on that as well as debriefings, and this is a challenge for the public sector. And I think it's a challenge for all organizations. Is they rely on that. And if you look at the causal factors, you look at 2 of the major ransomware incidents that have occurred in state and local governments. Both were the result of third parties. Texas was a managed service provider that just happened to be the MSP for those 23 cities, and they were compromised. And so that's how those cities became the victims of ransomware. It wasn't their individual cities. It was, again, through their MSP. The same thing with another state. It was through a third party, a software provider that was infiltrated, compromised, and they were able to find their way into an agency network in the state. So you're right. That's been the experience on the ground.
Yep. All right. Well, I know we
All right.
need to let you go. Again, very
Thank
much
you all.
appreciate your time this morning.
Yeah, my pleasure. Always glad to help our state members out, and please reach back out if you have any questions. But again, I invite you to certainly look at all the reports, and you may come back with some additional questions as you begin. And if, again, contacts, we can put you in contacts with some other states as well. But again, best of luck in your continued work and deliberations.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Doug.
Thank you. Yep. Let me stop sharing here. Get you off the NASIO slide deck.
All right. Just kind of taking pulse here. So Kevin, you're still back out. You're still out there. Samir's there. Colonel, is that you on the phone?
Yes, sir.
Okay, just double checking. All right, so we don't have a lot of us not a lot of numbers here this morning, but I thought that was a very, you know, good backdrop, thought-provoking backdrop for us to kind of maybe start from as we define our scope as a subcommittee. You know, there's two sides to that coin. One, it's very thought-provoking, and then secondly, it's like, okay, wow, that's a really broad landscape, right? How do we put some boundaries around what we're going to do as a subcommittee so that we can truly focus and get the content that we need into our subcommittee in order to create our deliverables as we go forward, right? So the good news is, I guess, to start here, the good news is we're not starting from scratch, right? We've got others that have done things. We've got resources available to start from. I think in large part, it's taking what's available and it's shaping that content for our deliverables that we're going to come up with as a subcommittee, if that makes sense. All right, so I guess at this point, a little bit of brainstorming. By the way, I will confess, I certainly haven't made it through all of the documents and resources that are available out there on SharePoint. I've looked through some of them. I went through the state of Michigan plan this morning, for example. That's part of my reason for referencing that we're not starting from scratch, because there are lots of other documents and resources available to read through that are very helpful as background. So I guess that's an encouragement as you have time. Go out there and read those, because I think it will give us a good reference point for a starting point and structure and content as well. And then we'll have to kind of tailor it from there, probably, right? Specific to our most recent thoughts and state models and structures and everything else. So I guess I will open it up a little bit here and just say, you know, there's a lot of thoughts that come to mind, a lot of references as to taking a whole of state approach. How do we cast the net, if you will, initially from a scope perspective to kind of define our boundaries? It feels like that's one of the first to-dos that we would have, is how do we define that whole of state model and approach, and then start to fill in the structure and the content to again fill out our deliverables. But I'm going to stop talking there for a minute. Kevin and Colonel, others, jump in and share any thoughts you might have.
Yeah, I agree. It's a big task. It's a massive topic. There's so many different pieces of it. It's like, how do we decide what is our highest priority? Prevention, resiliency, communication. How do you reach out to all of these different people? Some of them are really small. Some have tiny IT staffs, one single person, or no IT staff at all. Not positive how you reach out to all of those people and get them all the help they want. I guess it's a process. But for us, it's just figuring out what is the most important pieces that we want to make sure that we 100% cover. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to think about it, again, a little bit to that discussion we had right at the end with Doug before he dropped, we all have third-party dependencies, right? And to your point, Kevin, the smaller the entity that you are, it's likely that you have more third-party dependencies, right? Because you're simply not big enough to do these things self-sufficiently. And so every one of those third parties represents scope and vulnerability, bottom line. And so it's not just managing within your four walls, if you will, for sure these days. It's managing your third party relationships and same scope, but with each of those third parties, and that becomes pretty daunting pretty quickly.
This is Samir. Just for my own sort of curiosity, I'm curious to hear what your guys' perspective is on how we do with collaboration right now. Like, do we do a good job? Is there a lot of room for growth, and is there a lot of work to be done on collaboration?
That's a the word collaboration, Samir. I'm just kind of processing that, because that has multiple levels as well, right?
Absolutely.
That's a nice word to describe a very broad spectrum of scope. There's collaboration like we're having this morning, right? There's recurring collaboration with business partners and agencies and so forth. And then there's other flavors even of collaboration that exist in our formal contracts with third parties, right? And so there's lots of flavors of
Sorry, I don't know what I did there. I must have muted you. I'm so sorry about that.
that's okay. Everybody here okay now?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just saying that there's lots of flavors of that collaboration word, and it is key to keep open lines of communication, to boil it down to that definition, among each of us, among the scope that we're going to define that's critical within the context of our subcommittee. And again, I don't see how part of that context doesn't also point out maybe it's the statement of the obvious that we have to also do the same thing with each of our third parties. In other words, if we're one big ecosystem, you can talk about the weakest link in that context, right? And if you're not covering your weakest link, then that's probably your next action plan, and then the next and the next, right? And so we're looking at holistically from a whole of state. I mean, this is my view. You guys jump in. We're looking at this holistically from a whole of state model initially, but then that's going to drill down, because if we're going to truly have a healthy ecosystem, it has to drill down into other levels, like those smaller entities, Kevin, that you were talking about, and all the dependencies that they have, right? We can help from kind of the top down, but then they've got to also help themselves kind of in a bottoms up fashion to bring this all together to truly have an ecosystem that's more secure. And again, that's just personal opinion of how I think about it visually.
And Samir, just to touch on the question from my point of view, there's a lot of communication between our office and other state agencies and all that. And because of the work we do, we communicate out to counties a lot, but we don't have hardly any communication with cities or utilities, that sort of stuff. So, I mean, there's bits and pieces, probably all of us do some communication. So just how do you get all of that? Because if we're doing whole of state, we got to get everybody talking together. So.
Yep, absolutely.
I really like the idea, like when you refer to it as an ecosystem, that's really helpful visually.
Yeah, I think maybe at some point we may have a few visuals we can actually put together. Eventually I tend to think of things a little bit visually to try to communicate the context of the meaning, right? Some people are visual thinkers, others are not, but I think I saw Jonathan York join us as well a moment ago. So maybe pause for a second and let Jonathan introduce himself this morning. He's still on mute. Maybe he can hear us. We can circle back to him as well.
Sure.
All right. So maybe just to keep the conversation flowing and make some notes here and kind of define our model a bit. Going back again to whole of state, if we were to list the entities that we think from our scope make up a whole of state model, is that a worthwhile kind of quick exercise that we can put some stakes in the ground here as to what whole of state we think that means to this group?
Absolutely.
So we obviously have, and I'm just throwing stuff against the wall here. So we've got city, county, state level government entities, right? And we may need to break this down even more. And we've got representation even on this call from that vantage point.
I think even within the state level, you have, obviously Kevin and the administration, there's not necessarily there's, sort of practically there's opportunities to talk, but maybe not on paper, like there's not a direct line.
Yep. And then when we're
Yeah.
talking, we've mentioned universities, several of those within our geography and scope, I would think, right?
And I would lower that down to just maybe schools in general. maybe
Okay.
Smaller schools, just
Yep.
education in general.
Yep. All the way down K through 12, several references to that, right? Absolutely. I mean, I can certainly throw in the utility reference because I resemble that remark. And while oftentimes electricity and power get to the top of the food chain of that comment because everything needs power, that also includes things such as water, for example, of course, right? Because that's another critical infrastructure area for good reason. And gas for that matter as well. And then I guess the other one that I would mention there might be a question mark as to whether or not we also include communications, telecommunications, networking in our scope. I mean, what do we not do these days that is dependent upon networking from a telecom or broadband perspective?
Right.
There's a couple other ones that I can't remember if you said it or not, but military obviously would be
Yep.
involved in
Yep.
that.
Absolutely.
Tribal, not
Yeah.
necessarily just cities, but tribal also.
Mhm.
Right.
I'm curious how businesses fit into this.
Well, one thought, Samir, there is it goes back to that third party comment, right? If this is the path that you're on, many of us can't do business without our supporting businesses in place
Right.
to do so. I mean, it's
Sure.
kind of like the telecom and broadband reference. That one's right off the bat, right? If we didn't have those, we couldn't be doing what we're doing here this morning, for example. And so, it's to me, it's a matter of kind of where you draw the line on that comment of businesses, right? Maybe not formally within the scope of our model per se, but yet I think that reference has to be there because if we're not managing this scope with our third parties and businesses, then we would have a very false sense of security. And then as soon as you say that, of course, the scope becomes daunting.
That's exactly what I'm wondering how much mom and pop hardware shop, in Hutchinson, how much that has to play into an overall strategy, or if they're just sort of maybe not as relevant to this discussion. Well,
my answer to that, Samir, and I don't want to get too far in the weeds on this conversation, but we had this conversation internally quite a bit. And we try not to look at it simply based on size. We need to look at it based upon what level of access do those third parties have back into us as an entity, because it may be a smaller entity, but for example, if they have online access and logins into our systems, then we suddenly have a different level of care around how we treat that third party. Typically, the larger ones are the ones that have the most access, just kind of goes that way, but not always. Any other thoughts on kind of our boundaries and definition around whole of state?
I wonder if law enforcement might have a place in there.
Would seem appropriate, wouldn't it? and that really kind of bleeds into another area of discussion or thought, which is around kind of the various agencies that come into play during an incident. Obviously, the ones that we just talked about that frame up the kind of the boundaries of our ecosystem, to use that word again. But we've got other agencies that would become part of the picture in the event that there was an incident, feels like, such as law enforcement. Maybe another one that we haven't talked about this morning by name is the Fusion Center. Kansas Intelligence Fusion Center would come into play if there were an incident likely as well. And they could be both on the proactive side and the incident side. What else? Is there, I don't know the answer to this, perhaps Kevin, you do, or Samir or Doug would. Is there already an active, I'm going to use a reference we have in the utility industry, so I apologize, but it's always in my head, mutual assistance. Is there a mutual assistance type of a model in place if there's an incident at the state level to reach out for help? So for example, within utility space, we have different flavors of that. We have one when storms roll through, we can reach out and call for help from other states to help with restoration. But we've taken that model and kind of replicated it from a cyber perspective as well now. To where if we have a cyber incident or somebody else has a cyber incident, there's kind of an active network of help available. I'll call it phone a friend for a simple way to say it, right? Where you can reach out for help more broadly as well, if that would be of assistance. Is there anything like that in place already at a state level?
Could be mistaken, but I don't believe there's anything formal like that at the state level.
I've not seen anything formal, absolutely casually and just relationship wise, because you're talking to people and all that. There is people that you would reach out to and you would know that they could help and offer resources, but I've not come across one that's formalized where there's actual like agreement or anything like that.
Okay. Just
So
curious.
Charles, this is Jonathan York, and my apologies for joining late. I'm with Division of Emergency Management, but I can answer that a little bit. There's been kind of some informal discussions and collaboration that's included, Office of Information Technology Services and our department's information technology services, to look at and provide some assistance. In addition to that, one of the things that is kind of more nationwide is the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. So if there were a state disaster declaration, that's the implementing factor that we can request assets from other states to come in and provide assistance during times of disaster. And I know there have been some cyber task forces that have deployed to other states. I know Colorado within the past few years have garnered some support through the Emergency Management Assistance Compact to help provide them some support as well. A lot of it, from what I've heard though, is really coming more from the private sector than some of the governmental entities deploying to provide assistance. But that's just context on what some of the other states have dealt with to date.
Okay, helpful. Thanks, Jonathan. Part of what I think this also pulls into scope in terms of structure and conversation is feels like we will also need to determine kind of our scope of roles and responsibilities that creates a communication model, right? And there's probably different flavors of the communication model. There's a proactive one, and then there's one that takes shape in the case of an incident, right? I don't know if you all have predefined incident response plans that are role-based, for example, and so forth. We have one of those in place that we exercise periodically, but it really is generic in the sense that it's role-based, so anybody can fulfill a role in theory, by following the structure of the plan. And then the other piece of that is, what are all of the entities that you need to reach out to in the event there is an incident, so that everybody's on the same page, right?
Yeah, so the state response plan or the state emergency operations plan, the Kansas response plan, is all hazards, so it's functions based rather than task based.
Yep.
So like public safety and security, for instance, which is led by Kansas Highway Patrol, and Public Works and Engineering, and Transportation, which is led by Department of Transportation, for instance. So that's what the state response plan looks like, and that establishes the rules and responsibilities that each state agency has.
Makes sense, and it resonates as well. It makes me think back a year and a half plus ago, when suddenly an all hazards response plan has to adapt to a pandemic, right?
Yep.
All right. Let's see. What other thoughts do you all have? I mean, I know we could certainly go down a path when we're talking about our cyber incident and probably dive into the weeds there around the mechanics of that and everything else. Jonathan, I guess per your comment about an all hazards plan, I'm assuming that there's probably a general structure in there for declaring a state of emergency, to use that reference term. Is that true?
Yeah, there is. So, predominantly, a state of disaster emergency just really alerts the citizens that there's an event that has occurred, and that conditions may be primitive or austere from what normal life might be. Also, it's the implementing factor for tort liability protection and immunity protection for emergency responders, as well as a trigger point to indicate to stakeholders, not just the Federal Emergency Management Agency, but also other states, that Kansas has or will be exhausting their resources at the local and state level. So may need to request additional outside support. So that's an implementing factor for mutual aid compacts, not just at the state level, but also through a local disaster declaration. And then also it allows for temporarily rescinding certain laws or establishing policies by the governor to aid in exigent needed tasks for emergency response.
Okay. Feels like an element that we'll at least need to include as a subcommittee, even if it's just a reference into an all hazards plan, right? To just show that relationship model and the flow that it might take to, invoke and become part of a broader all hazards plan. And then I guess with the specific ability or need to rise to the level potentially of an emergency, right? Even if, a cyber-based emergency, if you will.
Sure.
Other thoughts out there? I know one of the natural discussion points that bubbles out of this is, it's always good to have a plan on paper. It's better to practice the plan periodically to validate it and make sure that you identify gaps and areas for improvement, and that the first time you're practicing that plan is not when you have a real issue, right? It's always good. So one of the things I would think that we eventually come up with is some type of a framework for a response exercise, recurring response exercise, that would pull in that ecosystem that we talked about earlier and pull in that whole of state model on some type of recurring basis, right?
One of the things that Jeff Maxon, he is in the National Guard, and he's floated this idea of like a stand down day. There's stand down days for any number of different things, for training in the National Guard, but having a stand down day just for cyber incident response might be one recommendation that we could float. That we, all of our stakeholders are involved in this one day where all we do is talk cybersecurity and run through a plan.
Yeah. I think that makes, excuse me, makes sense. The other one that comes to mind is perhaps even, having some recurring information sharing sessions, right? Just for awareness. And a lot of that, maybe a lot of that's often most helpful to the smaller entities that otherwise wouldn't hear it or otherwise wouldn't have an awareness of resources that are available and what do mitigations look like for risk, right? Things of that nature, and can be shared kind of at a state level if there's that type of an information sharing model and event in place.
Yeah, I know. We're involved in several federal ones that are similar to that, information sharing and all that. As far as the state overall, I think that would be great. I know there's lots of different resources out there in the modern world. There's Slack channels, stuff like that you can reach out to. I don't know if the state would set up something similar to that, where you can go out and research, talk, ask questions, just real informal feedback. Back to the exercise thing, one thing we've done and found helpful is tabletop exercises. Just run through some scenarios of this stuff's happening. What's your response? What are the things you need to be thinking about? We've found those helpful, but I haven't seen something like that at the state level either. That's all been federal and stuff like that. So I think that could be helpful.
Okay, yeah, it sounds good. And one of the things that we'll eventually think about and need to incorporate is if we have a list of recommendations of things that don't exist today, then what are our recommendations on how we implement those things, right? As well. It made me think about it, thinking about events and so forth of great idea that we should have one. How would we think about, actually doing those things?
I am thinking about sort of the practical side of like, if we're trying to get a bunch of different city managers or city CIOs all together in one gigantic auditorium, or how that actually works in a practical sense.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've certainly learned the last year and a half we can do things virtually, and that's certainly cost-effective model to do that. It also can be a safer model to do that as well. Oftentimes it should enable greater participation. So something that could certainly be considered. And then of course there's hybrids. There's the ability to get together with an online capability as well. So there's kind of the both model. Just have to see how things play out as we go forward, I suppose. But planning a large event is not necessarily as hard as it used to be. Sure. 2 or 3 years ago, when we used to think about all the logistics involved in that.
Sure.
All right, what are the thoughts? Again, I think we have a lot of materials to kind of think through. I think one of the things that is a natural starting point for this group is just maybe to develop an outline of what we think our structure would contain. And again, I'm all about flattery via copying the structure that others have come up with as well, right? As to what works, and most, a lot of thought has gone into those other deliverables that other states have done as well, and then tailoring that could certainly be an accelerator. We've got some reasonably aggressive dates that we're going to be dealing with as a subcommittee for deliverables, and I don't have those immediately in front of me. Samir, I don't know if you got that or not. If Ali was
October 11th, I want to say, is that first deadline,
which is not that far away.
Yeah, pretty quick. I will say that just from from our standpoint, I think that having these recommendations in place is going to be important. I don't think that we necessarily need to do a ton of legwork and a ton of developing ideas as much as we need to matriculate these ideas up to the larger larger subcommittee. It would be far too much work to put these, fully fleshed out plan before October.
Right. Okay. So I'm trying to think of what makes the most sense, kind of based on this initial discussion, to take a next step. I think we meet every other. I think we meet as a broader committee once a week, and as a subcommittee alternating weeks.
That's correct.
If I remember right, Samir talking to Ali. So in order for this group to make progress in the next 2 weeks, to say it that way, between now and our next meeting, kind of having maybe a bit of, I'll call it homework for lack of a better word, but how do we take today's discussion, kind of form that into some takeaways and homework that we can bring back together and begin to take some shape on things. I know one for myself is just reading through the materials that are out there so that we know what's available, what our starting point is, right? And to me, a natural extension of that is for everybody to maybe think about or jot down a framework or an outline that represents our scope, because we may have some different ideas on scope that we need to reconcile. But that to me, next meeting would be kind of putting a straw man and framework in place for our scope that has some words around it that we can then take and begin to flesh out and fill in.
That sounds great.
And then eventually those types of structures can get us into additional homework to bring content to the table and pull this together. And to your point, Samir, it's not the ultimate be all 100-page report by October. It's probably more of a set of ideas, recommendations, get some reaction to that, and then we detail those things out further. My thought. Okay.
Yep. My sense as well.
Once we have a better idea of the scope, there'll also be figuring out who we can bring in to an expert on those particular pieces that could help provide some guidance for us also.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. We can certainly bring in some speakers, maybe some speakers that represent those existing deliverables that are already out there. Lots of options probably available.
I will work with Allied to see if we might be able to reach out to NGA to see if they might be able to put us in touch with some of the, Michigans or Missouris or one of the other state CIOs that has developed some of these plans. Might be a great opportunity to hear from somebody.
Yep. Okay. Sounds good. All right. Any other thoughts this morning? Kevin, Jonathan, Colonel?
I don't think I have any more right now.
This is Colonel Hewitt. I'll go ahead and jump in after hearing everything. Obviously, from a military perspective, there are challenges, and one of which is state laws and regulations. Now, granted, I'm not a judge advocate by any means, but we do have quite a few on staff, and we work with them diligently when it comes to these type of issues, we'll say. And the reason why I say that is I'm sure you can go out there and Google and you can see that like states like North Carolina, Washington State, they are very active in their domestic response capabilities. However, a lot of the things that those states do are legal in their states, but not necessarily legal in the state of Kansas. So, and I get that's the reason why I bring this up is just because when it's a military response to something other than a federal issue, there's a lot more than, hey, it happens and then we can just react at that point. One one of which would be something, I'm working with OITS to have an MOA with them. It's taken roughly 3 months to get this MOA. I don't want to say moving, but there's a lot of, it's got to be reviewed by the Air Force units within the state that are cyber focused. It's got to be reviewed by the Army cyber units. And then it's got to be reviewed by OITS and then by the JAG. So, and then of course you work in deployments and other things in that scenario. And obviously it takes a little while when those people are out. So maybe something to consider moving forward. And another reason why I bring this up is because the Army and Air units within the state participated in Cyber Shield earlier this month, or actually last month. And part of that exercise was, hey, I'm going to show you how important it is to get ahead of the game as opposed to try to be proactive instead of reactive. And when you're doing an exercise, it's roughly 2 weeks long. Most of that time is spent trying to get MOAs in place so that the Guard could assist. And granted, there was a catastrophic event in the state of Kansas. Governor and the Adjutant General may assume a lot more risk than they normally would, and you know, direct forces to help in any capacity. But I also think that as a committee, this is something that we can put out there and hopefully get framework in advance. Then that reduces their amount of risk and also makes the Guard a more effective asset. And then other than that, you know, training is always important. It's always something that we do a lot of, obviously. And I guess that would probably be the next thing, is look at what kind of training is the state providing versus what kind of training is the federal government providing, and are there similarities, or is there a large curve that we can try to level out? I know we brought that up probably about an hour ago. So just my initial thoughts. I can.
Like there's going to be a lot of
answer any
opportunity to talk
questions
about
based on those.
sort of bureaucratic hindrances to some of this work. I do think there's probably a good opportunity to talk about some of those issues.
All right, agreed. Good input as well. One quick question, Samir. I think I heard Doug say this. The presentation that he shared this morning, we have access, or we'll have access to that?
Yep, it's on the SharePoint right now, actually.
Okay.
I'll have the SharePoint link.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah,
Everybody have the SharePoint link, I guess?
Yes.
I don't know if I do.
Yeah, and I
Go ahead and
don't
send
believe I
it.
do either.
I'll go ahead and send it out again.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right. I guess my thoughts, Samir, is I think we kind of had a productive discussion here this morning. We've got some work to do. Next time, kind of put together again some structure by which we'll begin to fill in the blanks and work towards our initial deliverable.
Yep. I will. I'll write up I took some pretty good notes. We'll get them written up and I'll send them around, as well as a link to the SharePoint. We'll plan on doing some reading, and then we'll reconvene in a couple weeks.
Super. Sounds really good. Appreciate everybody taking time to join. I guess next week we'll have a broader committee meeting.
Yep.
Right. Okay.
So,
All right. Sounds good. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good weekend. Safe weekend.
you as well.
Thank you.
Copy,
Bye now.
thank you.